Now, the first two tools, scale and overlap, really go hand in hand, and they're the two easiest tools to use to begin to create the sensibility of depth or space in an image. Our intuitive understanding of scale and overlap relate to our physical experience of being bodies in the world. We understand physics. We understand the way material objects work in relation to one another. So if something's closer, it should be bigger. If it's further away, it should be smaller. If one thing is in front of another, that means it's closer to us, and if it's behind that same thing, that means it's farther away from us. Overlap plays with some interesting ideas about visual dominance in an image, which it can talk about like which object is the most important. And if you want to manipulate a sense, play with overlap and manipulate overlap, it could be fun to play with an object that should appear to be in front but isn't in front. And when that happens, we start talking about transparency, where there's some confusion about the sense of overlap in the image. In transparency, a portion of the object is made visible in the overlapping plane. And so there's some question or mystery about how these two things relate to one another. Intersection is also, I guess, essentially a play on overlap, where there's the illusion that planes or objects are passing through one another, right? One thing is coming into one thing and coming out the other side. So I guess it also plays with scale as well. So where is the moment of intersection in this image? Obviously it's with the blade that Judith is holding as it intersects Holofernes' neck. And then in this second image by Magritte, where is the moment of intersection? It's this moment where the train is emerging out of this fireplace. Distinct moments of intersection in an image usually create a strong sense of emphasis or focal point, and they can also be used to create a wonderful moment of drama. So most of the tools we've been talking about are about modifying an experience of space on the flat surface as they extend into the surface. Foreshortening is interesting in that it is a tool used to create a sense of space that extends into our own space. So what happens in foreshortening is an artist will modify an object or a figure's proportions to appear as if the object or the figure extends out of the picture plane into our own plane. The Baroque artist Caravaggio is a great example of an artist who uses quite a bit of foreshortening in his paintings. So look at the figure's hand on the right side, how it extends out, or it appears to extend out of the canvas into ours. Or this his crucifixion of St. Peter. Where's the foreshortening? Say there's some subtle foreshortening happening here with his feet, as the feet appear to maybe extend slightly out of the canvas into our own space. So the last tool we're going to look at is the use of perspective systems. And there are a couple types of perspective systems. We're just going to look at two. And perspective system is, what that means is when an artist manipulates lines and angles to create the illusion of depth. Now you may have heard of linear perspective, which is one of the perspective systems we're going to look at, and that's to create the illusion of a kind of perspective through line. But we're going to see that all cultures devise spatial systems to create the illusion of depth in their art. They're not all based on line. Some could be based on shape or light, or have more emphasis in color. They could put more emphasis on scale or overlap, or have fixed vantage points from above or below. Keep in mind that these may or may not be rendering physical space, but instead could attempt to render spiritual space, or even a space of dreams. Now, two major world projection systems that do attempt to render real space are oblique projection and linear perspective. Let's take a few minutes to look at each of them. What's known as oblique projection is a kind of perspective system used in a lot of traditional pictorial arts of Asia. And what's happening with oblique projection, you might notice that it's what's called a parallel projection, that the lines don't converge to a point, that all of the lines run parallel to one another, and that the face of the object, in this case the building, is parallel to the picture plane, and the sides of the building run parallel at 45-degree angles, but they never converge to a vanishing point. Right? So what happens in oblique projection? Depth is reduced, right? There isn't the illusion of deep, deep, deep space. So oblique projection actually doesn't attempt to mimic space as it actually is. But what it does is it gives the artist a way to give more information to the viewer about what they're seeing. Now, linear perspective is the perspective system most prominent in Western European art. We associate it with the Renaissance. Some of the artists in the early Renaissance were the ones to develop this type of perspective system. And what does it really do? What is linear perspective? In a linear perspective system, you'll see that often the face of the object or the building is parallel to the surface, right? But then the sides of the object will recede to a vanishing point. Artists make use of linear perspective to give the most accurate version of the scene that they're witnessing in terms of scale and proportion. So you also have some choices in linear perspective. One of the choices is where you place the vantage point. So if you've got a situation where you have what we have here called what we would consider frontal perspective, where we are in a fixed position, all of the action is laid out to us, that most of the action is running parallel to the picture plane, in this case the table and all of the figures seated at the Last Supper. But there's only one vanishing point, right? There are only kind of two architectural elements, there are only two sides of the space, two side walls that converge to a single vanishing point, or converge to a vanishing point is the way to say it. And that's called single point perspective. Now, artists will use single point in a perspective in an image to create a sense of unity or emphasis. It works with a strongly central composition if you want to create strong emphasis in the center. I remember last week we looked at images that use strong central compositions. And it's really just a way to heighten the sensibility of the power of the central image. It's like turning the volume dial up on a perspective system to keep your eye focused on one place. But if you're less interested in having the image have this fixed point, right, in the image, if you want something to feel more naturalistic, or to have more just visual variety, or to feel a little less balanced, you can position the vanishing point off to the side, in which case we would call this diagonal recession. And so you can see that there are kind of two sides to this space, right? There's the one side of the building and the alley, and then the other building. But the walls of those two buildings don't extend to the same vanishing point. They actually go in two different vanishing points. And we call this two-point perspective. Two-point perspective is helpful if you want to create more lifelike, more complex compositions. Two-point perspective is probably truer to life. When you're walking down the street, looking down side streets, buildings are extending in all different directions. So there's always a sense of perspective moving around you. And the perspective is always changing, your vanishing point is always changing. So again, if you want to create a more naturalistic effect to something, think about using diagonal recession or two-point perspective. Now you can have even more than two perspective points in an image. You can have 3 or 4 or 5 or even more. What happens when you start adding multiple perspectives in sort of off of one object, I would say, then things start to get a little funky. Things would get more complicated, they get more confused, the space can feel more enigmatic. M.C. Escher was the master of multiple point perspective and loved to use different perspective, multiple vanishing points to create this interesting illusion of space, these kinds of whimsical, kind of confusing, puzzling spaces. So if you like this sort of thing, Escher is someone you might enjoy looking at more.